Miss Marple and the Whisper. Behind the Curtain. Chapter 1. The Whisper at Renfield Hall. The sun fell like golden lace across the manicured lawns of Renfield Hall, a stately manor nestled quietly at the edge of the village, where time still moved in sync with church bells and gossip. The annual Renfield Summer Garden recital was in full swing, and the genteel hum of voices mixed with the light strains of a chamber quartet floated through the air like perfume. From the rose-lined pathways to the crisp linen tablecloths laid with cucumber sandwiches, deviled eggs, and treacle tarts, the entire affair was arranged with a kind of painstaking charm that only the English countryside could produce. Everything had its place. Everyone had their role. In the corner of the grand lawn, beside a flowering camellia bush, sat Miss Jane Marple, a figure easily mistaken by strangers for someone's pleasant elderly aunt who had wandered in for the free sandwiches. Dressed in soft lavender with white gloves and a neatly pinned hat, she held a china teacup with both hands, her sharp blue eyes blinking benignly behind round spectacles. She appeared completely content, unhurried and ordinary. But she wasn't. She was observing. Always observing. Colonel Withers, a broad-chested man with the temperament of a walrus and the sensitivity of a boot, spoke too loudly near the punch table about his days in India. Mrs. Pellings, widow of the late vicar, laughed just a little too eagerly at his jokes. Lady Agnes Sedgwick, the hostess of Renfield Hall, stood with her spine held perfectly straight, overseeing the proceedings like a proud curator. Her estate, after all, had been the centrepiece of village life for decades. Inside the house, the music changed, now something melancholic in G minor. The playing was delicate, uncertain, as if the pianist hesitated with every other note. A ripple of curiosity passed through the guests. "That's Clara," Lady Sedgwick remarked to no one in particular, though her chin tilted toward Miss Marple. "My niece. She's painfully shy, poor girl, but she does adore Chopin." Miss Marple gave a slight nod, a sensitive choice for a summer afternoon, but quite beautiful. Lady Sedgwick smiled politely. "Yes, well, Clara has always been rather delicate." There was something fragile about Clara Denholm. Miss Marple had met her once before, during a luncheon arranged to welcome her back from Geneva, where she had been studying music. Clara had struck her as a young woman divided in two, one part wistful innocence, the other weighed down by something unspoken. She had the pale complexion of someone who avoided sunlight, and eyes that never quite held still. As the piece ended, a soft applause drifted from the open French doors of the music room. The quartet outside resumed their playing. Guests sipped Pims and traded smiles. And then it happened. A curtain stirred. It was the window drape of the west-facing drawing-room, thick damask velvet in dusty blue, far too heavy to be moved by breeze alone. But there it was, fluttering, as if brushed by an unseen hand. Not forceful, not wild, just wrong. An odd, delicate motion, like something had shifted in the stillness. Miss Marple noticed it at once. Her gaze flicked toward the window with almost imperceptible alertness. She looked at the sky. There was no wind, not even enough to rustle the paper-thin napkins on the serving trays. "Must be the breeze," Colonel Withers muttered nearby, reaching for his third tart. Before anyone could respond, before anyone could even think to ask what might have caused, A scream split the afternoon like a thunderclap. It was sharp, terrified, real. Every conversation froze mid-sentence. Tea sloshed in cups. Chairs were pushed back, heads turned toward the house. From the corridor just beyond the music room emerged a young maid, Elsie, barely 16, with freckles and trembling hands. Her face had gone chalk white. Her apron was stained with what looked like fallen flower, petals and something darker. She's collapsed, Elsie stammered. Miss Clara, in the side room. She's not moving. Panic did not explode, not in Renfield. Instead, it spread like ripples beneath glass. Subtle, but unmistakable, several ladies gasped. A few men rose too quickly from their chairs, knocking knees against tables. Lady Sedgwick went rigid. Miss Marple didn't flinch. She quietly set her cup back on its saucer with a faint clink. "Which room?" she asked the girl softly, but firmly. Elsie's eyes darted toward the house. "The music room, ma'am. The little dressing room behind it. I was sent to bring her tea." Lady Sedgwick placed a trembling hand on her chest. "She must have fainted. She's always been terribly sensitive. The excitement, the performance. But it wasn't excitement. Not this time." Inside Renfield Hall, a quiet horror had begun to form. Clara Denholm was found crumpled on the floor beside the baby grand piano in the side room. Her head rested at an unnatural angle against the floral rug. A narrow iron candle holder lay inches away, its base stained. Her breath came shallow. There were no witnesses, no sounds of struggle, no sign of forced entry. Only the curtain had stirred, and then the scream. The local doctor, summoned immediately, examined her with swift concern. "She's alive, barely. A significant blow to the head must have been sudden, but no signs of a fall." "Then it was deliberate," someone whispered. "It certainly wasn't clumsiness," the doctor replied grimly. Lady Sedgwick's voice quavered. "Why would anyone harm Clara? She's so gentle, so quiet." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had slipped away from the bustle of the crowd. She stood before the very curtain that had first moved. She lifted the edge with gloved fingers, revealing a long, shallow scuff mark on the window-sill and a faint thumbprint on the brass latch, just above eye level. She bent slightly, noting the angle. The window hadn't been opened. The lock was old but firm. The movement had come from inside. Behind her, voices filled the hall, hushed, suspicious, brimming with fear, barely masked by propriety. She was probably attacked by a tramp. I heard she had a secret suitor. One of those foreign types. Nonsense! It must have been an accident. Miss Marple stood silent, absorbing it all. As evening fell and the police were summoned, the recital was quietly ended. Guests departed in murmuring clusters. The quartet packed their instruments without a word. Renfield Hall seemed suddenly darker, as if its long windows no longer welcomed the sun. Miss Marple remained, not because she was asked, not because she was curious, but because something had whispered behind that curtain, not in sound, but in presence. Something had shifted, however subtly, and she had felt it. In that shift, in that stir of velvet and silence, was the first clue. And Miss Marple, smiling faintly at nothing in particular, had already begun sewing the thread that would eventually lead to the truth. Chapter 2. The Village. React the following morning in St. Hedwig's village. The news spread with the inevitability of cream in hot tea. By breakfast, every cottage, tea shop, and church pew hummed with variations of the same sentence. Something happened at Renfield Hall. By mid-morning, that something had been inflated to include everything from a robbery gone wrong to a jealous lover's violent outburst. Someone even suggested Lady Sedgwick herself had lashed out when Clara missed a musical note. Absurd, but repeated nonetheless with gleeful relish. At the Three Chimes Tea Room, where much of Renfield's less urgent business was transacted, the usual hum of gossip had crescendoed into a near symphony. "I heard she was strangled," whispered Mrs. Goodbody, a widow with a fondness for morbid embroidery and scandalous literature, left in her own blood with a candle-holder beside her. "And to think I just complimented her dress the other day." "No, no," said Mr. Sykes, "the village's part-time postmaster and full-time busybody. She wasn't strangled, it was a knock on the head. They say it might have been an accident, but I've lived long enough to know that when young women fall, they don't usually land beside weapons." "Poor girl," muttered Mrs. Vole, who sat stiffly by the window and hadn't eaten her crumpet. "She was too quiet. That sort always attracts trouble. Never know what they're thinking." Behind them, at a small corner table with the best view of the room and none of the noise, sat Miss Marple. She sipped her tea quietly, listening not just to words, but to tones, patterns, inconsistencies. In gossip, people revealed far more than they realized. And right now, what the village was revealing, without knowing, was how very little anyone knew about Clara Denholm. Except Miss Marple. She recalled the girl's distant smile, the way she glanced over her shoulder, as if someone might be following her, even indoors. There had been something restrained in Clara, like a song barely played, something unfinished. And now, silence. Back at Renfield Hall, the mood had soured. Gone was the crisp perfection of the recital. The tablecloths had been removed, the piano lid closed. Lady Sedgwick spent the morning in a state of brittle anxiety, flitting from drawing-room to corridor with nervous energy, repeatedly declaring that Clara just needed rest. She always had a fainting tendency, she insisted to the village constable, Mr. Pinner, a well-meaning man with more height than sense. As a child, she once collapsed during her own birthday party. Excitable nerves, that's all. "But the wound, Lady Sedgwick," Pinner began, but was promptly waved off. "She's under the best care now, and the doctor says she may wake in a day or two. Let's not create a fuss." But there was already a fuss. It had moved past tea-rooms and into the parlours and post-offices, into pews and barber-shops, and the theories flowed like blackberry jam in summer heat. Among those adding fuel to the flame was Miss Edith March, a piano tutor who had once taught Clara as a child. Thin, sharp-nosed, and always armed with a grievance, Miss March had taken to offering her unsolicited opinion to anyone who would listen. "I always said she was too delicate. Not just her constitution, her mind. Always flinching, always distracted. And her mother died young, you know. Some say she never recovered." Miss Marple, who happened to be nearby selecting seed cakes for her housekeeper, paused. "Interesting," she said gently. "Did you know her well?" Miss March looked down her long nose. well enough to know there was trouble. That girl was like a room with the windows closed, something heavy in the air. I dare say it finally suffocated her. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Rooms are often quite revealing, aren't they? Meanwhile, in the village green, 2 children played with sticks near the duck pond and spoke of the ghost at the hall. Rumours had begun to drift down, even into the minds of the young. Renfield, which had always moved slowly through its summer routines, now had the twitchy, nervous air of a place that had been stirred, and would not settle again soon. By late afternoon, even the village vicar, Reverend Alec Lytton, had weighed in, discreetly, of course. I do hope Lady Sedgwick is not brushing this aside. Clara is a troubled soul, to be sure, but that does not excuse violence. Something is terribly wrong in that house. His wife, Mrs. Lytton, more forthright, nodded vigorously. She's always so concerned with appearances, Agnes Sedgwick. That recital was more about reputation than music. And what of the Sedgwick family? Behind their closed doors, silence ruled. Mr. Henry Sedgwick, the master of the house, had taken to the study and refused most visitors. He had barely spoken since the incident, according to the servants. "The master's hands were shaking this morning," whispered cook to the maid, "like leaves in a storm." "Think he did it?" the maid asked. "Lord help us! He never liked Clara, not really." Cook shook her head. "Doesn't need to be hate. Sometimes secrets come out in ugly ways." And so the theories brewed. Oh, family squabble over money, a spurned love affair, hidden from all, a mistaken identity. Was Clara even the real target? A long-buried family scandal no one dared name. Through all this, Miss Marple continued her quiet circuit. She did not question anyone directly, not yet. She didn't need to. People talked. They always did. And in doing so, they revealed far more than they intended, particularly when trying to look innocent. That night, as the village lamps glowed like yellow pearls along the lanes, Miss Marple sat in her small parlour, knitting untouched on her lap. She stared thoughtfully into the fire. She was afraid of something, she said aloud, to no one in particular, and someone else knew it. She stood, walked to her writing desk, and made a note. Velvet curtain, movement without breeze. Clara Denholm, quiet, observant, fearful. Window latch, thumbprint, family tensions, rumoured. No one heard today thing? Why? Miss Marple's pen paused. Unless they weren't listening. She underlined the word, and outside her cottage the whisper of the wind stirred a branch, but not the curtain. That particular whisper had come from something else entirely. Chapter 3. The Threads No One Pulled. The morning after the incident, the villagers of St. Hedwig's awoke to rain. Not the kind that lashes at windows or drenches you in seconds, but a slow, persistent drizzle that blurred the hedgerows and made every cobblestone glisten under grey skies. It was a weather for reflection, for staying indoors and revisiting yesterday's gossip with a slightly more dramatic lens. At Renfield Hall, things were not so tranquil. Clara Denholm remained unconscious. The doctor had returned twice, checked her pulse, murmured something about trauma response and waiting it out, and left again with the kind of sigh that said he didn't expect much to change. A nurse had been summoned from Basingstoke. Meanwhile, Lady Sedgwick insisted to anyone who would listen that her niece had always been prone to spells of that nature, though no one could remember hearing of such a spell before. The local constable, Mr. Pinner, had returned too, wearing his good uniform and his bad ideas. He interviewed the house staff with a kind of apologetic clumsiness, as though he were sorry for interrupting their routine rather than investigating a potential crime. "And where were you when Miss Denholm was found?" he asked the butler. "In the pantry, sir," replied Mr. Kettle, a tall, grave man who had served the Sedgwicks since long before Clara was born. "Setting the wine service. Anyone see you there?" "No, sir. I'm usually alone when I decant the Madeira." Pinner frowned and scribbled that down, though he spelled Madeira as Madeira. "Right. And the other maid, Elsie, was it? She found the body?" "I found Miss Clara. Yes," Elsie said, her voice small, as though she feared even the echo of her words. "She was just lying there. Her head. Oh, I don't like to think about it, sir." "No signs of a struggle?" "No, sir. Just that curtain. I saw it move, I swear." Pinner rubbed the back of his neck. "Drapes. Don't hit people, girl." "But they moved just before." He sighed. "Well, it doesn't make much sense. Must have been an accident." Miss Marple, who had quietly arrived under the pretence of delivering flowers from her garden, sweet peas and foxgloves in a simple jug, listened without saying a word. Her eyes wandered from Elsie's trembling hands to the scuffed edge of the drawing-room carpet, from the hallway's grandfather clock, which had ticked evenly through the entire ordeal, to the shallow indent in the arm of Clara's favourite chair, as if she'd gripped it tightly before rising. She noticed things others missed. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage under the usual excuse of discussing hymn selections for Sunday service. She sat with Reverend Lytton and his wife, who were predictably eager to discuss the recent events. "It's all rather dreadful," Mrs. Lytton said, pouring tea with a shaking hand. "I told Alec we shouldn't have gone to that recital. I felt something strange in the air that day." "Spiritual heaviness," the Reverend said, gravely, "though I'm not one to jump to superstitions." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I'm quite sure it was nothing so supernatural. Still, it's remarkable how often our instincts are right, even if we can't quite explain why. She's such a strange girl," Mrs. Lytton added. "Clara, I mean. Quiet, melancholy. I always thought she looked like someone waiting for bad news." "And how did Lady Sedgwick feel about her niece staying here?" "Oh, she loved Clara," said the vicar's wife, with a hesitation that betrayed the opposite, though perhaps it was more duty than affection. Henry, her husband, barely acknowledged the girl, poor thing. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Did Clara ever mention friends? Someone from her past, perhaps? The Reverend looked thoughtful. Not to us, no. Though I do recall she asked about the village archives once. Said she was trying to understand something about her family's history. That, Miss Marple thought, was interesting. Her next stop was the local library, a quiet stone building that smelled of old paper and wet umbrellas. Mr. Collins, the librarian, peered over his glasses with mild irritation when she entered. "Looking for something, Miss Marple? Actually, I wondered if Miss Denholm had visited recently." He sniffed, hardly ever came in. But a few weeks ago, yes, she asked for parish records. Old ones, death notices and such. Thought it odd. Did she mention why? It said she was looking for an old newspaper article. Something about a child who went missing during the war. Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly. A missing child? He nodded. From the Sedgwick estate, no less. But I told her we'd lost most of the papers from those years, damp in the archive room. Miss Marple thanked him and left quietly. So Clara hadn't just been fragile and quiet. She'd been searching, digging into something long buried, something in her family's past. Perhaps she hadn't fallen victim to a moment of weakness after all. Perhaps she had gotten too close to a truth someone wanted to stay hidden. That evening, back in her sitting room, Miss Marple lit a single candle despite the electric lamps. Candlelight, she always said, helped her think. She sat in her armchair, knitting in her lap, the needles still. Clara had been researching a child from the war. Someone went missing. Someone connected to the Sedgwick estate. And now Clara had nearly died in the very room she played music in. Coincidence was always a comfortable explanation, but rarely a correct one. She jotted notes in her small journal. Curtain movement. Is someone hiding? Clara investigating family history. Lady Sedgwick evasive. Henry Sedgwick silent. Window not opened. No forced entry. She paused. Clara may not have been the intended victim. That was a chilling thought. What if someone else was meant to be behind that curtain? What if someone had waited in silence, in velvet shadows, for the wrong person to arrive? Miss Marple tapped her pen against the page. She would need to speak to Clara, if Clara ever woke. But until then, there were plenty of other people to observe. And human nature, she knew, always left footprints, especially when it tried to hide behind curtains. Chapter 4. The Piano, the Gardener, and the Obvious Answer. By the third day, with Clara Denholm still unconscious, and the whisper of attempted murder growing louder than any bird call in St. Hedwig's, Constable Pinner did what men of his nature often do when overwhelmed. He settled on an obvious answer. Someone saw the gardener walking near the music room before the incident, he declared, chest puffed at Renfield Hall. He had access. He knows the layout. He's new. That's something, isn't it? The gardener in question was Thomas Larch, a wiry man in his late 20s with sun-darkened skin, a modest moustache, and a quietness that people who are naturally loud often mistake for guilt. He had started at Renfield Hall only 6 weeks prior, after leaving a landscaping job near Norwich, under vague circumstances involving personal disagreements. Pinner had summoned him to the front parlour, where he stood uncomfortably between a mahogany sideboard and a vase of drooping carnations. He wore a cap in his hands and mud on his boots. "I didn't touch her," he said plainly. "I barely knew her. But you were near the music room that afternoon. I was trimming back the hydrangeas on the west side. Nearest window. Opens to that room, yes. And the curtain was disturbed. I didn't touch the curtain, sir. I never even stepped inside." Pinner scribbled furiously in his notebook, the tip of his pencil breaking. Miss Marple sat quietly beside the fireplace, unnoticed by most, except for Lady Sedgwick, who cast her a glance now and then as though trying to gauge how much her presence mattered. Thomas continued. I saw a man through the side door earlier that morning. Don't know who he was. Didn't seem staff." Pinner leaned forward. "You didn't mention this before?" "Didn't seem relevant until now. He was gone by lunch." "Description?" "Tall, pale brown coat. He had something wrapped in paper under his arm. Maybe sheet music. I figured he was part of the performance." Lady Sedgwick stirred. "None of the musicians fit that description. That's because he wasn't one of them," said Miss Marple quietly, speaking for the first time. Her voice, though gentle, silenced the room. "Which makes it rather important, doesn't it?" Pinner's moustache twitched. "You think this man's the attacker? I think it's far too soon to arrest anyone simply for trimming hydrangeas. Still, the village reacted to the gardener theory like dry leaves to flame." "He's not from around here," muttered Mrs. Vole, tucking her umbrella beneath her arm. "That's all it takes. Outsiders bring trouble." "He was seen near the hall, near the time," added Mr. Sykes. "What more do you need?" "He once got into a shouting match at the feed store," someone else recalled. "Over turnips. The conclusion was, to most, forgone. It was Thomas. Had to be. Quiet, strange, private, and worse, not local. But Miss Marple was not most people." Back at Renfield Hall, Miss Marple requested a moment to visit the music room again. Lady Sedgwick reluctantly obliged, assigning Martha, the housekeeper, to accompany her. "Please, don't touch anything," Lady Sedgwick said with brittle formality. "Clara's scent still lingers in there." Miss Marple stepped into the soft gloom. The room had not changed. A single shaft of dusty light fell across the closed lid of the baby grand. The curtain, the one that had fluttered, now hung perfectly still. "I notice there are no footprints in the carpet," Miss Marple said aloud, almost to herself. Martha blinked. "Ma'am?" "The carpet. That thick rug below the window. If Thomas Larch had entered through here, surely he'd have left some trace. The ground was damp that day." Martha peered closer. "Well, I suppose so, yes." "But there's nothing." She turned toward the piano. "And this, may I open it?" Martha hesitated. "If you're careful." Miss Marple lifted the piano lid. Beneath it, resting in the groove between the frame and the felt, was something unusual. A single earring, small, gold, pearl. She held it up with gloved fingers. "Clara's?" Martha asked. "I wouldn't think so. Clara wore silver that day. This is older and too heavy for her style." Martha frowned. "Perhaps Lady Sedgwick's?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Perhaps." She slipped the earring into her reticule, then turned to the window latch again. The same latch she'd examined 3 days earlier. She noticed a new detail. The brass had been polished. Too recently. There was no dust in the groove. Someone had tried to clean something away. That evening, at her cottage, Miss Marple brewed chamomile tea and re-examined her notes. Gardener. No motive, no evidence. Clara. Unconscious, but not random target. Piano. Earring hidden, not dropped. Curtain. Movement without wind presence. Stranger in brown. Unaccounted for. And then something odd occurred to her. Why had Clara been alone that afternoon? Was a garden recital. She was part of the music. Yet she played indoors, unseen. Why? Unless someone wanted her away from the others. A Set-Up. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the vicarage again. She found Mrs. Lytton tending flowers. "Did Clara ever mention anyone she was writing to?" Miss Marple asked. "Any recent letters sent or received?" Mrs. Lytton looked surprised. "Now that you mention it." "Yes, just last week she asked Alec to help her post something urgent to someone in London. She wouldn't say who." Miss Marple nodded. "Did she seem frightened?" "Very." There was a pause. "She asked me something strange," Mrs. Lytton added. "Yes?" "She said, 'Have you ever learned something about your family you wish you hadn't?'" That evening Constable Pinner stopped by Miss Marple's gate, clearly proud. "We're preparing to bring Thomas in for questioning. Enough's enough." Miss Marple regarded him with calm amusement. "And what do you believe his motive was?" Pinner hesitated. "Jealousy, unrequited love, or maybe robbery. Gone wrong. I see," Miss Marple said, folding her hands. "And what do you suppose Clara discovered that made her tremble in the vicar's garden? A matter of turnips? Or something a bit more personal?" Pinner blinked. Miss Marple leaned forward. "My dear Constable, you're standing in front of a locked door with a key that doesn't fit. And the real key is hiding behind the piano, next to a whisper and a lie." Chapter 5. A hidden clue in velvet and dust rain fell steadily that morning, tapping gently at the windows of Miss Marple's cottage, as though nature itself were encouraging her to remain inside and think, which truthfully was precisely what she intended to do. She had already written 3 letters, burned one, and set the kettle to boil for the second time. The weather always put her in a reflective mood, but today it wasn't the dampness that stirred her restlessness. It was the growing sense that something small had gone unnoticed, something tucked away, like a moth in the folds of an old curtain. The earring found inside the piano remained on her bureau, placed neatly in a china dish. She had cleaned it gently with a dab of vinegar and water, and now examined it again. It was not Clara's, that much was certain. Clara wore delicate jewellery, thin silver chains, pale studs, nothing too bold. This earring, however, was bold. Dior, in colour or size, but in era. A fine antique piece, likely Victorian, with a faint maker's mark on the back. T.H. and Co. Miss Marple recognised the initials. Thomas Harding and Co., a now defunct London jeweller whose trinkets were highly sought after by Edwardian debutantes and those of tasteful inheritance, not something a nervous girl like Clara would wear to a village recital. No, this had belonged to someone older, someone from the house. She tucked the earring back into its dish, placed a linen over it, and rose. Her return to Renfield Hall that day was less noticed than her previous visits. The constable had grown weary of her suggestions, and the Sedgwicks had retreated into what polite society called distress, which mostly meant Lady Sedgwick refused to entertain questions, and Mr. Sedgwick locked himself in the study with his newspapers. But the housekeeper Martha remained welcoming in her quiet, tight-lipped way. Miss Marple asked if she might, just once more, look in the music room. "I'll wait here," Martha said at the threshold. Miss Marple nodded and stepped inside. The piano sat silent and solemn in the middle of the room, as though mourning its last performance. Clara's sheet music still rested on the stand, though the pages were curled at the edges from the damp. The curtain, the one that had stirred, was stiff and unmoving in the rainy air. Miss Marple approached it. She had looked here before, yes, but not thoroughly enough. She touched the hem. Something snagged. She bent slightly, lifting the fabric's edge, and found it. A tiny thread of dark blue wool, barely an inch long, caught in the hem stitching. She plucked it out and held it in her palm. Renfield Hall's staff uniforms were black, not blue. Clara had worn soft grey. The quartet had performed in white and cream. No one, as far as she could recall, had worn navy blue, except... She straightened slowly, her breath quiet. Except for Lady Sedgwick, Miss Marple distinctly remembered the navy blue bolero jacket Lady Sedgwick had worn that day, embroidered with fine black trim, not the sort of thing she wore often. In fact, it was a bit dated, perhaps a hand-me-down, or something brought out for symbolic effect. More interesting still was the fact that Lady Sedgwick had changed clothes before the constable arrived that day. A quiet detail, perhaps, but one that didn't escape Miss Marple's attention. She took out her notepad and carefully wrapped the wool thread inside a folded page. A thread in a curtain, a velvet movement no one could explain. An earring tucked into a piano. Someone had been standing behind the curtain that day, listening, watching, and they had dropped something. Outside the room, Martha waited patiently, knitting a plain grey scarf. She looked up as Miss Marple returned. "Everything quite the same?" she asked politely. "No, not quite," Miss Marple replied, tightening the clasp on her handbag. "Just a small detail. But you know how small things grow," Martha gave a slow nod. "They do tend to, yes." Miss Marple studied the woman's face for a moment, then asked quietly, "Martha, how long have you worked here?" 21 years, ma'am." "Then you'd know the Sedgwick family inside out, I imagine." "As much as one can. People don't always show themselves fully, even when they live under the same roof." Miss Marple smiled. "No, I suppose they don't." She paused, then added, "Did you know Clara was researching someone? A child who vanished during the war." Martha's needles paused. "I heard something of it." "Did she find anything?" "I think she found more than she was meant to," Martha said softly. "She asked me once about an old photograph, one that used to hang near the west stair. Said it had a name on the back, but that photograph went missing years ago. Curious." "Not really," Martha muttered, resuming her knitting. "Things disappear when they're inconvenient." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple spent the evening writing again. This time she didn't burn the letter. It was addressed to her cousin, Harriet, a former librarian in Bath, with a special knack for tracking down rare documents. She included only a short message. "Dear Harriet, can you find any records of a Sedgwick family adoption during the years 1940-1945? Particularly any involving a child listed under a different surname. Something seems to have been hidden. Fondly, Jane." She sealed the envelope, satisfied. The curtain thread now sat beside the earring, both small enough to be dismissed, yet both deliberately overlooked. Two pieces of a story no one wanted to tell. The next day, she visited the vicarage again. Reverend Lytton was out on parish calls, but his wife greeted her with open curiosity. "Has something changed?" Mrs. Lytton asked, handing her a cup of tea. "Only slightly," Miss Marple replied, "but enough." She sipped her tea, then added, Tell me, dear, when Clara played piano that day, who suggested she perform indoors instead of outside with the others?" Mrs. Lytton blinked. "Why, Lady Sedgwick, I believe. She said Clara was too delicate for the outdoor acoustics." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple murmured, setting down her cup. "Too thoughtful, perhaps." That night, as the wind stirred the hedges and the rain fell in cold waves, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour and reflected on all she had uncovered, and on what remained clouded in shadow. She thought of Clara, silent and unmoving in her upstairs room. She thought of a whisper behind a curtain, a movement in velvet, a woman changing clothes too quickly, and a girl asking questions about a photograph that had long since vanished. And someone, somewhere inside Renfield Hall, had been trying to keep those fingers from reaching the present, but threads unravel when tugged, even royal blue ones. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The skies cleared briefly on the 6th day, as if the weather had finally grown weary of hiding the sun. The villagers of St. Hedwig's emerged from their cottages like squirrels after a storm, cautious, twitchy and ravenous for the latest developments, and they were not disappointed. Word had spread that Clara Denholm had stirred. She opened her eyes, whispered Mrs. Vole at the bakery. Didn't say a word, but the doctor said she blinked. Once, that's something. By noon, the version had evolved. Clara had allegedly gasped a name. Henry, some claimed, or help, or perhaps it was only a breath mistaken for something more. Miss Marple did not concern herself with the variations. The fact that Clara had stirred at all was what mattered. It meant her memories were likely intact. It meant the answers, long buried beneath pleasantries and piano keys, might soon surface. And that meant someone in the village was growing very nervous. At Renfield Hall, a strange tension clung to the wallpaper. Lady Sedgwick had taken to afternoon rest, claiming exhaustion. Mr. Henry Sedgwick remained mostly unseen, although cook said he had taken to pacing the halls late at night, like a man walking through an invisible fire. Miss Marple requested a visit, and was reluctantly granted an audience with Lady Sedgwick in the rose sitting room. It smelled of talcum powder, faint lavender, and something else, something metallic, like nerves. Lady Sedgwick reclined on a chaise in a pale silk robe, her eyes slightly sunken. "You've always had an interest in inconvenient things, Miss Marple," she said without greeting. "I find them useful," Miss Marple replied. "They tend to point toward truth, and truth has a habit of surviving storms. Some truths," Lady Sedgwick said coldly, "are best left unspoken." Miss Marple's smile remained kind. "Especially in old families, I find. Legacies are such fragile things, so easily stained by one misstep." There was a pause. "What do you want?" "A photograph, one that used to hang near the west stairwell." "A child, I believe." Lady Sedgwick blinked. "It was removed some years ago, yes. We were redecorating." "Of course. And the frame?" "Broken or misplaced. I don't recall." "Yet Clara did," Miss Marple said softly. "She remembered it well enough to ask the housekeeper about it, and the vicar's wife. She believed it had a name written on the back." "Silence," Miss Marple continued. "She was asking about someone who vanished during the war. A child, I believe, who was perhaps taken in unofficially Lady Sedgwick straightened, the silk robe pulling tight against her shoulders. "Are you suggesting we adopted someone in secret? That's preposterous." "I'm suggesting Clara had reason to believe something in her family wasn't what it appeared to be, and it frightened her. Enough to dig into archives. Enough to ask questions." Another silence, deeper this time, heavier. Then, like a lid easing off a boiling pot, Lady Sedgwick exhaled. "There was a boy," she said at last. "A refugee evacuated from London in 41. Thin, pale, hardly spoke for the first month. We took him in. My husband wanted to send him away once the war ended, but I grew attached." "What happened to him?" Lady Sedgwick's eyes were distant now, unfocused. "He stayed with us for 5 years. Then one day he vanished. I was told he'd run off, but there were rumours, servants talking, whispers about Henry losing his temper." "Henry? My husband has always had spells. Darkness. He keeps them under wraps now. But back then..." Miss Marple let the silence finish the sentence for her. "Clara found the story," Lady Sedgwick said bitterly, "and she wouldn't let it go." Later that day, Miss Marple asked to speak with Henry Sedgwick. The butler tried to dissuade her, but she insisted. She found him in the study, surrounded by unopened mail and half-drunk sherry. His eyes were shadowed, his tie askew. "Mr. Sedgwick," she began, "I believe Clara discovered something you did not want her to find." He laughed, dry and hoarse. "And what do you think that is, Miss Marple? That I murdered a boy 50 years ago?" "I think something happened to that child, something that would not reflect well on this house." Henry set down his glass. "It was a long time ago. You can't dig up ghosts and expect them not to scream." "She found his name, didn't she?" His lips twitched. "She found more than that. She found a letter, tucked behind the photograph frame, written by the boy. He'd planned to tell the authorities, said he'd seen something my brother did." "Your brother?" "Dead now, drowned in 48. But back then he was unwell. Clara was convinced there'd been abuse, that my parents covered it up. She said the boy hadn't run away. He'd been silenced. And what did you say to her?" "I said to let the dead stay buried." "And when she didn't?" "I told her she didn't know what she was talking about. Did you harm her?" Henry's jaw clenched. "No, I'm not that man any more." "But you were once." He said nothing. That evening Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the sky turn the colour of old paper. Her mind turned over everything. A missing child, a hidden letter, a buried family shame. Clara's soft footsteps through the house. The curtain, disturbed by someone waiting. The earring, the wool thread, and a family unravelling at the seams. The next morning, a knock came at Miss Marple's door. It was Martha, the housekeeper. "I think you should have this," she said, holding out a letter. It was addressed in Clara's hand. The envelope had been torn and hastily resealed. Miss Marple opened it. Inside was a single sheet. "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident. There are too many things they never told me." I found the letter, the one from Peter. "The doy. Truth is in the past. It always has been." Miss Marple folded it carefully. The time for quiet observations was over. It was time to expose the whisper behind the curtain, and the silence that followed it. Chapter 7. Another twist in the choir tower. It was just past 7 in the evening when Miss Marple, returning from the vicarage with a wrapped fruitcake under one arm, and rain misting her spectacles, noticed something unusual near Renfield Hall. A light was flickering in the small upper corner room. The old nursery, long unused. This wouldn't have concerned her in itself, if she hadn't also noticed Mr. Kettle, the butler, briskly exiting the back door at that same moment. He carried nothing, but he walked quickly, too quickly for a man of his age and discretion. Miss Marple stopped by the gate, watching. There was no child in that nursery now, hadn't been for decades, so why was the light on? She stood in the lane for a full minute, the mist dampening her shoulders, before she turned and began to walk home, thoughts already stitching together something cold and undeniable. The next morning brought news that unsettled the entire village. Martha, the housekeeper, calm, patient, and ever faithful, had been found unconscious at the foot of the stairs leading up to the nursery. A broken porcelain lamp lay near her, and the carpet beneath had been oddly twisted. It was discovered by Elsie, the same maid who had first found Clara. She was going up to clean, Elsie told the constable, pale and trembling. Said she'd heard a noise in the night up there, like a drawer opening. Thought someone might have gone, poking about. The assumption was another accident. Martha had slipped, the lamp had fallen, and perhaps she'd fainted. But when Dr. Haynes examined her, he said the truth softly, with deep concern. This wasn't a fall. This was a push. A second attack, in the same house, within the same week. And now, Miss Marple's theory was no longer a private sketch in her notebook. It was living, unfolding, and escalating. Constable Pinner returned, flustered and wide-eyed. I was wrong, he admitted half to himself. Can't be the gardener. He was accounted for last night. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting, as Pinner paced Lady Sedgwick's sitting room, replied, I did say hydrangeas rarely push housekeepers downstairs. Pinner blinked. You think it's the same person who hurt Miss Clara? I think someone is trying very hard to make sure the past stays silent, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Lady Sedgwick, now paler than ever, was nearby. She hadn't spoken a full sentence all morning. Miss Marple turned to her gently. Lady Sedgwick, who else knew about the letter Clara found? About the child? No one, she said, her voice barely audible. Only my husband, and Martha, I suppose. Miss Marple nodded. And Martha said nothing? She never would. She's loyal. She raised Clara like her own. Yes, Miss Marple said, which is why she may have been silenced. Lady Sedgwick trembled. Do you think she'll wake? We must hope, Miss Marple said, but if she does, I fear someone may try again. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested one final walk through the nursery. She was accompanied by Dr. Haynes, who had always respected her instincts, even when they veered from conventional logic. The room was dim, wallpaper peeled slightly at the corners. A dusty rocking horse sat in the corner beside a shuttered dollhouse. There was no childlike warmth here any more, only echoes of something colder. Miss Marple looked at the drawer Martha had apparently mentioned. Inside, it was nothing, save for a slip of folded fabric. A child's mitten, blue wool, stained, at the edge with something old and brown. She held it up. Blood? Asked the doctor. Hard to say, Miss Marple said, but it's been kept for years. Why? Dr. Haynes nodded slowly. Some memory we haven't met yet. Then Miss Marple said, Doctor, you've known Mr. Sedgwick for some time. Have you ever treated him for emotional instability? The doctor's lips pressed together. We don't talk of such things here, Miss Marple, but yes, he has had dark seasons, episodes. Would you say he's capable of violence? Not impulsively, but if something unravels the mask he wears. He paused. Perhaps. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat down to write again. Not to her cousin this time. To Inspector Cray, a colleague she had worked with before, a man who respected facts and instincts. She wrote, Dear Inspector, I am not yet certain who pushed Martha, but I believe it is connected directly to the discovery Clara made. Deshiru, attacks are escalating, and the culprit is not who the village expects. I advise great discretion. Renfield Hall is not just harbouring old secrets. It's protecting someone dangerous. I expect another move soon. Possibly tonight. Yours, Jane Marple. That night, Renfield Hall went dark early. Servants were dismissed. Lady Sedgwick took to her room. Mr. Sedgwick reportedly had retired to the library, but Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat by her window with a shawl over her knees, watching the lane, watching the hall, and waiting, not for an attack this time, but for the next mistake. Because, in her experience, the guilty always moved too late, or too early. And someone had just tried to silence Martha, not out of panic, but out of precision. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The morning after the second attack dawned cold and unusually silent in St. Hedwig's. Not the peaceful quiet of village calm, but the kind of charged stillness that comes when something is about to break, the kind of silence that holds its breath. At Renfield Hall, everything moved slowly. The staff tiptoed. Breakfast was hardly touched. Clara remained in a coma. Martha, the housekeeper, was stable, but unconscious. Her fall had left her with a head wound not dissimilar to Clara's. 2 victims, 1 house, 1 history. Miss Marple had never liked forcing anyone to speak. Her strength lay in listening, and in watching what people said when they believed. No one was listening at all. But the time for quiet observation had passed. It was time for something deliberate. A test. And so, shortly after 11's, Miss Marple requested tea in the Rose Room, and asked that Mr. Henry Sedgwick join her. Surprisingly, he agreed. He entered stiffly, wearing a pinstriped suit that looked half a size too large, his eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. A deep line had formed between his brows, a crack in the mask of gentility he had always worn with such care. "You asked for me, Miss Marple?" he said, voice clipped. "Yes," she said cheerfully, pouring the tea herself. "I thought a moment of civilized conversation might be useful. It seems we're both trying to understand the same mystery." He raised an eyebrow. "You think this is a mystery, then? Not just an unfortunate series of accidents? Don't you?" He smiled coldly. "People fall, especially in old houses." She handed him a teacup. "Indeed, though it is unusual for them to fall just as they uncover long-lost secrets, wouldn't you say?" His hand paused briefly. Not enough to be noticed by most, but enough for Miss Marple. He recovered. Clara was always chasing shadows. Her mother filled her head with nonsense. Nonsense, Miss Marple said, about the boy who disappeared in the war, about Peter. His face hardened. You know about Peter. I know enough. I know Clara found his letter. I know she asked questions about the photo that once hung on your staircase. And I know that letter is now missing, along with the photograph, which raises the question, who would benefit from removing them? He said nothing. I also know, she continued softly, that Martha was the last person Clara confided in, and that someone wanted Martha quiet as well. Mr. Sedgwick stood. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying, Miss Marple said gently. I'm inviting you to help clarify. Perhaps Clara misunderstood something. Perhaps it wasn't as sinister as she feared. But until I hear it from you, all I have are pieces. And when pieces don't fit, someone usually forces them to. He stared at her for a long time. Then, Peter was a liar. Ah, Miss Marple said quietly. So there's the truth. Mr. Sedgwick's lips twitched. He said things. Accused my brother of terrible acts. You know how dangerous rumours like that are, especially in families with names and land. If people had believed him, everything would have been ruined. Was it a lie? He didn't answer. I think Clara didn't believe it was, Miss Marple continued. I think she read Peter's letter and saw it for what it was, a confession, a warning, a desperate attempt to tell the truth. She must have come to you first, didn't she? His fists clenched. She said she'd go to the police. She wanted to make it public. And that, Miss Marple said, frightened you more than anything else ever has. He turned sharply toward the fireplace. The clock ticked. I didn't mean to hurt her. Miss Marple said nothing. I just wanted the letter. Just that. I followed her that afternoon. She was headed toward the music room. Said she'd left. The letter tucked in a music book. I asked her to give it to me. She refused, said the truth mattered more than our reputation, that she'd rather destroy the Sedgwick name than live under it. He closed his eyes. I reached for her. She backed away, tripped, fell. But you didn't call for help. He nodded slowly. I froze. Then I cleaned the window latch, moved the curtain, hid the letter. I didn't know she'd survive. Miss Marple stood, and when Martha began asking questions, she remembered Peter. She suspected. I panicked. He looked at her, his voice suddenly raw. What would you have done, Miss Marple? Watch everything your family built turn to ash? I would have told the truth, she said, because I've lived long enough to know lies are the heaviest inheritance one can leave behind. That afternoon she summoned Constable Pinner. Mr. Sedgwick didn't resist. He confessed quietly, carefully, not to murder, but to covering up what had happened, to withholding evidence, to panic, to pushing Martha when she confronted him outside the nursery that night. I just needed her to stop, he whispered. I wasn't trying to kill her. Miss Marple knew that sort of ending. It was always just a little push. The village received the news with its usual blend of shock and satisfaction. No one had expected it of Mr. Sedgwick. He was well-spoken. He hosted flower shows. He once donated a bench to the churchyard. But under all that polish, Miss Marple had seen what others had missed. Fear disguised as propriety. Clara remained unconscious, though the doctors were hopeful. Martha, bruised but recovering, would soon be told what her loyalty had cost her. And Miss Marple, as always, returned to her garden, where things were quiet, and only the truth grew wild. Chapter 9. The Curtain Drawn. Back by the time Inspector Cray arrived from Basingstoke, Renfield Hall was quieter than it had been in days. The press hadn't yet descended. The locals, while bursting with questions, had the good sense, or perhaps the old English habit, not to knock at the gates. Inside, the tension that had once clung to the air like damp wool had begun to loosen, replaced by the weariness that always follows a storm. But the final threads had yet to be woven. Inspector Cray, a tall man with kind eyes and a notebook far more detailed than he ever let on, met Miss Marple in the Rose Room, where the entire household had been gathered at her request. Lady Sedgwick, pale and still tightly corseted in appearance, sat rigid on a floral settee. Constable Pinner, beside her, looked like a man afraid he'd missed something essential. Mr. Kettle stood near the window, expression neutral. Elsie, the young maid, clutched her apron. Dr. Haynes, Martha's attending physician, leaned in from a far corner, listening. And Henry Sedgwick, now stripped of composure, sat with slumped shoulders and a gaze fixed firmly on the rug. Only Clara was absent, though her name hung over the room like a ghost. Miss Marple stood, holding her handbag clasped at her waist like a prayer book. "Thank you all for coming," she began gently. "I fear I am too old to drag this out theatrically, and I've never been one for scenes, so I shall speak plainly." A hush followed. Even the distant ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to pause. This began with a whisper. Quite literally. A curtain stirred when no wind moved, and a quiet young woman was found near death. It might have seemed an accident, or nerves, or even coincidence. But as with all true things, the details refused to settle. She turned slightly. "Mr. Sedgwick, when Clara fell, you claimed it was an accident, that she tripped. You reached for a letter. She panicked, fell, and struck her head. You froze. You removed the letter. You tried to erase your presence, and you hoped desperately that she would not wake." Henry said nothing. "But you were not the first thread, only the last." Gasps stirred. Faint and collective, Miss Marple continued. "The seed of this entire tragedy was sown decades ago. During the war, a boy named Peter Ashcombe was taken in here, unofficially. A refugee sent from London during the Blitz. He stayed 5 years. Then he vanished. Officially, he ran away. Unofficially, well, Clara learned otherwise." She looked to Lady Sedgwick. "Peter left behind a letter, didn't he? You found it, but you didn't destroy it. Why?" Lady Sedgwick's lips quivered. Because I wasn't sure what was true. I loved that boy. I wanted to believe he left, but there was always doubt. And I kept the letter in case someday the truth could be born." "Was more than doubt," Miss Marple said gently. "You suspected your brother-in-law had harmed him. Perhaps you even suspected your husband knew." Henry flinched. The letter, long hidden, was discovered by Clara. She'd seen the photo, asked questions, found the old music book where it had been tucked. It terrified her, and rightly so. And yet, instead of hiding it, she came forward. She believed silence was a lie. She believed Peter deserved justice. Miss Marple paused, then drew out 2 small objects from her handbag and laid them carefully on the tea tray. A pearl earring and a folded piece of cloth containing a thread of navy blue wool. "Lady Sedgwick," she said quietly, "you changed your dress the afternoon Clara fell." Lady Sedgwick's mouth opened, then closed. "This earring was found inside the piano. The curtain contained a thread from your jacket. You were behind the curtain, watching. Why?" Lady Sedgwick's hands trembled. "I knew she had something," she whispered. "I wanted to know what. I never meant her harm. I followed her. I stood behind the curtain, hoping to confront her once she'd finished playing. But then she fell. I panicked, I fled, and I told no one. She was your niece. I was afraid, not just for her, for what it would mean if the truth came out about Peter, about Henry, about the entire history of this house." Miss Marple's voice softened. "But the truth came out anyway, didn't it?" Lady Sedgwick nodded, tears on her cheeks. "And so," Miss Marple said, looking at Inspector Cray, "we have 3 people tangled in this web. One who long ago vanished, one who tried to hide him, and one who tried to speak for him, and was silenced." She turned, "But we must not forget Martha either, the housekeeper, loyal, quiet, and sharp-eyed. She had been here long enough to know everything. She heard Clara's questions. She asked her own. And when she went to the nursery and found the child's mitten, kept perhaps as a symbol or memory, someone followed her." She looked to Henry. "You pushed her, didn't you? Not to kill, but to stop her, to buy yourself time." Henry did not deny it. "I never hurt Peter," he muttered, "but I knew my brother did, and I said nothing. I buried it, like they asked me to." "Like you were taught to," Miss Marple said. "And silence, Mr. Sedgwick, is not always harmless." Inspector Cray stepped forward. "We'll need to speak further, of course," he said formally, "but I believe Miss Marple has once again made the path clear." Lady Sedgwick, pale and broken, whispered, "What happens now?" "Miss," Marple answered, "the past becomes visible, and from there we begin again. Truthfully, this time." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, a small fire crackling in the hearth. She held the photograph, recovered from an old ledger Clara had tucked it into before her fall. It showed a young boy, slight and smiling, standing by the fountain at Renfield Hall. On the back, written in a child's hand, "For Lady S, thank you for not making me invisible." Miss Marple sighed. She folded the photo and placed it in her notebook, where she kept the case notes no one ever saw. Some mysteries, she had learned, weren't about murder. They were about what we choose to remember, and who I am, and what we try to forget. Chapter 10. Aftermath. 2 weeks later, St. Hedwig's had nearly returned to its familiar rhythms. Church bells tolled on time. The tea-room refilled its cream bun trays without murmurs of scandal. And yet, something in the village air had shifted. Not in volume, St. Hedwig's had always been quiet, but in weight. The sort of silence that comes after something has been broken, after something long buried has finally been unearthed. Clara Denholm had awoken 3 days earlier. voice was soft, her memory intact, and her spirit, though bruised, unshattered, when she asked Miss Marple, was it all real? The old woman had simply nodded and taken her hand. Yes, my dear, and you were right to look. Clara had wept, but not just for Peter or for herself. She wept for the house, for her aunt, for the family that had lived in glass and pretended it was stone. The letter she had found, Peter's final note, was given to Inspector Cray, who forwarded it to the appropriate authorities. There would be no prosecutions for the crimes of the 1940s, but there would be acknowledgement, and in cases such as this, that was its own kind of justice. Lady Sedgwick, once the pillar of refinement, was now rarely seen beyond her garden. She had not been charged, she had committed no crime by law, but her social circle had thinned like mist. There were whispers about the missing boy, about the portrait that had never returned to the stairwell, about the woman who had watched from behind a curtain and said nothing. She never spoke publicly about Peter, but she began to place white flowers by the fountain every Friday, even in rain. That, Miss Marple thought, was something. Henry Sedgwick had gone away. Some said to the north. Others had said abroad. No one asked directly. No one wanted the full truth laid bare again. Martha, the housekeeper, made a full recovery and quietly resumed her duties, though now she walked with a cane and a stiffness in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. She and Clara often took tea together in the afternoons by the piano. The baby grand had been moved to a different room. Clara never played Chopin again. Instead, she took to Bach. Steady, mathematical, safe. Miss Marple sat in her own sitting room, knitting soft grey wool into a new scarf for her nephew. She had refused all forms of recognition for her efforts, as always. I only paid attention, she had told Inspector Cray, which is more than most people do. Cray had laughed and offered her a case in Southampton. She declined politely. She had too many tomatoes in the garden for travel. At the Three Chimes tea room, the villagers returned to their old habits, though what happened at the hall was still whispered about between bites of lemon sponge. The tale had softened with repetition. Suspicion had dulled into legend. Children who passed Renfield Hall now whispered stories of a ghost boy, not a lost one. Miss Marple knew better. Some ghosts didn't haunt halls or portraits. They haunted names. They haunted silences. One rainy evening, Clara knocked at Miss Marple's cottage. She brought a letter. It arrived this morning, she said, from Peter's niece. Someone traced her through the letter. She'd heard. What happened? She asked for the photograph. Miss Marple took the letter gently, read it twice, and then handed Clara the envelope she had kept safe all these days. The photo, Peter smiling by the fountain, still lay within, uncreased. You should give it to her, Miss Marple said. Let someone remember him properly. Clara hesitated. Do you think he'd forgive them? My family? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I think he already did. Otherwise, he wouldn't have signed the letter with such kindness. Clara smiled, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you. You were very brave, my dear. Never forget that. I was afraid the whole time. Miss Marple looked up. That's what courage is. After Clara left, Miss Marple returned to her fireside chair. The day had grown dark early, and the wind moaned faintly through the eaves. She thought of the thread of blue wool, the velvet curtain, the earring, so many small things. She thought of Peter, a boy who had been hidden, then lost, then almost forgotten, until one young woman chose to ask, why? Miss Marple had known many secrets in her life, but the ones that lingered the longest were always born not of hatred, but of cowardice, that soft, dangerous silence that grew from the desire to protect one's name instead of the truth. And yet, the truth had emerged anyway, because people like Clara existed, and people like Peter had left behind just enough. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. The rain outside was steady but soft. Not a storm this time, just the earth remembering how to breathe again. And inside her quiet cottage she smiled, because evil had tried to hide behind a curtain, and failed. Chapter 11. Epilogue. The Garden. That remembered spring came late to St. Hedwig's that year. April dragged its feet, reluctant to warm the soil, and even the daffodils seemed unsure of their place. But by early May, the garden behind Miss Marple's cottage had finally bloomed, not all at once, but in staggered confession. Snowdrops, crocuses, bluebells. Life, it seemed, returned not with fanfare, but with gentle insistence. Miss Marple stood in her herb patch, trimming thyme, when she saw Clara walk up the lane. She was carrying a basket lined with linen and something else, something wrapped in deep navy blue velvet. They exchanged soft greetings. Clara looked healthier now. There was still a faint shadow under her eyes, but her steps were firm. She wore a pale cardigan and a quiet expression that, Miss Marple thought, was no longer sadness but understanding. "I found something," Clara said. "I think you ought to have it." She opened the velvet cloth and revealed the missing photograph frame from Renfield Hall's west stair. Inside was Peter's picture, restored, polished, the silver around it gleaming with fresh care. "I brought it to London," she said. "His niece made a copy, but the original, I couldn't let it go completely." Miss Marple took the frame gently. "He looks quite real now, doesn't he?" she said, tracing the boy's smile with her eyes. "Not like a ghost any more." "Think he'd be happy to be remembered," Clara said, "even if it took a long time." They sat together beneath Miss Marple's ivy-covered trellis, two women of vastly different years, bound by truth and the quiet power of naming what others had chosen to forget. "I'm going away," Clara said after a while. "Oh, just for a little while. A composer I met in Bath offered me a chance to teach and assist with arrangements. It's not a grand opportunity, but it's mine. I'm very glad," Miss Marple said warmly. "You deserve to leave with a clear conscience." Clara hesitated. "And them, my aunt, the family." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her wrist. "We cannot choose the soil we grow from, my dear, but we do choose what we carry forward." Clara nodded. Peter was family, even if no one said it. "They said it by hiding him," Miss Marple replied. "It's a strange kind of recognition, but recognition all the same." That evening, after Clara left, Miss Marple returned to her writing desk. She removed the last page of her notebook, the one titled "Renfield Case, the Curtain," and wrote the final note beneath it. "Justice is not always punishment. Sometimes it is memory. Sometimes it is one person telling the truth, and another choosing to listen. She closed the notebook and placed it beside her kettle. Then she stepped into the garden. She walked past the cabbages, the strawberries, the trellised beans, past the stone bench where sparrows often landed, toward a patch of soil not yet claimed by any root. And there, in the soft dirt, she planted a small silver tag, etched simply with 2 words, Peter, remembered. She did not tell anyone. She didn't need to. The next Sunday, the vicar gave a short homily about sins of omission and the importance of not just hearing, but responding. Most villagers nodded vaguely, but Clara, seated near the back, looked straight at Miss Marple, and the older woman gave her a quiet smile in return. The truth had passed from silence into speech, and though it had hurt, though it had disturbed everything that had been built on soft lies, it had also, finally, set something free. Later, in her garden, Miss Marple sat with tea and the Sunday paper. The birds chirped overhead. A bee danced near the lavender. And just for a moment, the velvet curtain of the past, the one that had once concealed so much, felt entirely drawn back. Chapter 12. The Last Truth. It was an ordinary Tuesday when Miss Marple received a postcard from Clara Denholm. The envelope was pale blue, the handwriting slightly firmer now, though still tilted like someone who once learned calligraphy and never quite forgot it. The card read, "The sun is brighter here in Bath." Or maybe it's just that I've stopped walking with shadows. Thank you, Miss Marple, for listening, for believing, for helping me tell a story that no one else wanted to hear. I think I understand now. Justice isn't always a courtroom. Sometimes it's a garden. Clara. Miss Marple read it 3 times, then placed it on her mantel beside a dried lavender bundle. She stood for a moment, staring out at her garden, where the roses were just beginning their second bloom, and a single robin hopped confidently near the path. A story had ended, and with it, something deeper had settled. A truth not just about Clara or Peter or the Sedgwick name, but about human nature itself. That evening, over tea with the vicar and his wife, Miss Marple finally said what had been quietly forming in her mind since the day the curtain had stirred. "It's not always malice, you know," she said gently. "That's the mistake people make. Most of the world's cruelties come not from evil, but from fear." The vicar nodded thoughtfully, refilling his cup. "Fear of what, do you think?" "Of being seen," Miss Marple replied. "Of being known. People will bury anything, children, truths, entire histories, just to keep the illusion that everything is as it should be." Mrs. Lytton frowned. "But isn't that just cowardice?" "No," said Miss Marple. "Cowardice is doing nothing. What we saw at Renfield Hall was something worse. A kind of love that turned in on itself. A desire to preserve a name so fiercely that it forgot to preserve the people carrying it." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Clara did something most don't. She broke the silence, and it nearly cost her everything. But in doing so, she gave someone who had been erased a name again. That's justice, too. Quiet, uncomfortable, but real. She returned home that night and found the moon glowing above the hedgerows, casting a silver hue across her garden. She thought of all the mysteries she'd solved, all the deaths, all the lies, and still, this case, the one without a corpse, without a trial, without even a headline, had stayed with her more than most, because it wasn't about proving who did it. It was about proving that it mattered, that a whisper behind a curtain, a missing boy's letter, a girl's persistent questioning, those things were not small. They were enormous, because when we forget someone, they vanish twice, once from the world and once from memory.